At exactly 1:47 in the morning, the digital eyes of the house went dark. The space between 1:47 and 2:28 in the morning is a 41-minute forensic void. The air in the house seemed to grow colder as the reality of a violent crime set in. They realized that whoever had been in the house had taken extreme care to leave the majority of the property undisturbed, creating a chilling juxtaposition between the orderly living spaces and the sudden violence that must have occurred near the door. The family, standing just outside the threshold, was completely unaware that the narrative of their loved one's disappearance had just violently shifted from a medical emergency to a major criminal investigation. The silence of the Catalina foothills was about to be broken by the arrival of crime scene technicians and major case detectives. The officers inside knew that every second that passed was critical, and they knew that what they had just found on the floor near the entryway was only the beginning of an incredibly dark and complex puzzle. Resting starkly against the flooring near the entryway was a distinct physical anomaly that shattered any remaining hope of a peaceful resolution. It was a smear of blood. What happens in a severed timeline like that is the difference between a solved case and a total system failure. The physical presence of biological evidence at the threshold of the home transformed the missing persons report into a dynamic, active crime scene. Forensic analysis of that specific biological material would later confirm a perfect DNA match to Nancy Guthrie. That single drop of blood was undeniable proof that a violent physical altercation had taken place right at the boundary between her safe haven and the outside world. It was a silent testament to a struggle that the disconnected security cameras had been deliberately blinded from recording. The discovery of the blood prompted a massive escalation in the law enforcement response, but the physical evidence was rapidly overshadowed by a digital development that plunged the case into a far more sinister territory. Almost simultaneously with the discovery at the house, ominous communications began filtering in. These were not vague demands or desperate pleas. They were highly sophisticated ransom notes delivered via encrypted email. The digital footprint tells us that a violent extraction occurred, but the physical evidence left. The messages outlined chilling ultimatums and demanded substantial payouts in cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin. They came with strict, immovable deadlines and a terrifying implication of what would happen if the demands were not met. The sudden arrival of these digital extortion demands confirmed that this was a highly organized, targeted abduction. The perpetrators had not only physically extracted an 84-year-old woman from her home, but they had also orchestrated a complex digital ransom scheme designed to evade traditional financial tracking. The intersection of physical violence at the entryway and sophisticated cyber extortion created an incredibly volatile scenario for the investigators. They were suddenly fighting a war on two entirely different fronts. One front was the physical crime scene in the Arizona desert, where forensic technicians needed to meticulously document every millimeter of the entryway to preserve the chain of custody. The other front was the dark web, where federal agents and cyber experts had to race against the behind. Tells a story of catastrophic procedural errors that would compromise the entire investigation clock to trace encrypted Bitcoin transactions and verify the authenticity of the terrifying emails. The stakes could not possibly be higher. The life of a vulnerable elderly woman was hanging in the balance of this dual investigation. Every decision made by law enforcement in these critical early hours would either pave the way for her safe return or doom the entire case to failure. The presence of the blood dictated that the physical scene must be treated with the utmost reverence and scientific rigor. It was the only place where the physical reality of the abductors intersected with the victim. It was the anchor point of the entire investigation. Yet, as the gravity of the ransom demands pulled the attention of high-ranking officials toward the digital hunt, a catastrophic lapse in judgment was quietly taking shape at the physical property. The very officers standing over the blood evidenced the officers tasked with securing the perimeter and protecting the fragile biological clues were preparing to make a decision that would haunt the investigation for years to come. Law enforcement agencies rely heavily on clear timelines to establish the sequence of events during an abduction. If you find value in uncovering the harsh realities of criminal investigations and understanding exactly how crucial evidence is handled or mishandled, please make sure to subscribe to Seth Crime Stories. The contrast between the brilliant execution of the cyber ransom and the impending failure at the physical crime scene is a textbook example of how investigations derail. The blood at the door demanded absolute procedural perfection, but what happened next was a devastating blow to the forensic integrity of the entire case. The initial officers on the scene correctly identified the entryway as the primary zone of conflict. They saw the biological material and understood its immense value. In a standard protocol environment, this discovery would trigger an immediate and total lockdown of the property. Yellow tape would seal the perimeter, and a strict log would be initiated to record every single individual who crossed the threshold. The air conditioning would be controlled to preserve the degradation rate of the blood, and specialized technicians in protective suits would begin mapping the area with laser scanners. Yet in this specific instance, the very people sworn to protect the integrity of the evidence may have caused irreparable damage to the chain of custody. Every microscopic fiber, every latent print, and every drop of bodily fluid in that entryway held the potential to identify the individuals who sent those Bitcoin demands. The physical scene was the only tangible link to the ghosts operating behind the encrypted emails. The preservation of that specific space was not just important, it was the absolute foundation of any future prosecution. But the standard protocol was about to be abandoned in a move that continues to baffle forensic experts to this day. While the physical crime scene lay waiting for proper processing, investigators turned their attention to the digital footprints left behind in the hours before the cameras went dark. The extraction of the security footage provided a chilling window into the premeditated nature of the attack. By rolling back the data logs prior to the 1:47 in the morning disconnect, they uncovered the exact sequence of events that compromised the digital fortress. The footage revealed an alleged intruder moving with calculated precision through the exterior perimeter of the property. When a high-profile crime scene is mishandled, the truth gets buried under a mountain of contaminated evidence and public spectacle. This individual was heavily concealed, wearing dark, non-reflective clothing that obscured any identifying physical features. A mask covered their face, completely ensuring that the infrared lenses captured nothing but a menacing silhouette. More alarmingly, the footage clearly showed the suspected individual carrying a concealed firearm tucked securely into their waistband. They also carried a tactical backpack, likely containing the tools necessary for the extraction and the sabotage of the security network. This was not a random burglary or a crime of opportunity. The deliberate movements captured on the video demonstrated a high level of situational awareness and a clear understanding of the camera placements. The alleged perpetrator actively approached the security hardware and initiated the sequence that would sever the connection to the outside world. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew exactly who was inside. Watching that footage provided law enforcement with a definitive timeline of the breach. It confirmed that an armed hostile element had penetrated the perimeter just before the system blind spot began. If you want to look past the sensational news headlines and meticulously dissect every single oversight made at this crime scene, from the video combined with the blood at the doorway and the encrypted ransom demands, presented an overwhelming mountain of evidence pointing to a highly dangerous organized abduction. The investigators had the suspect on camera. They had the biological aftermath of the struggle, and they had the ongoing digital extortion. The narrative of the crime was writing itself clearly and undeniably. This was the exact moment when the physical environment of the Catalina Foothills home needed to be treated as a sacred forensic site. The evidence required a meticulous vacuum-sealed approach to ensure that no outside contaminants could compromise the DNA or trace elements left by the masked intruder. The chain of custody for the biological material found at the entryway had to be ironclad to withstand the brutal scrutiny of a future defense attorney. The digital evidence from the server and the physical evidence from the floor had to be linked together by flawless police work. However, the administrative decisions being made regarding the control of the property were moving in a drastically different direction. Despite having clear visual evidence of an armed intruder and verified DNA of the victim at the scene, the DNA leadership within the local law enforcement agency began to waver on the necessity of maintaining a hard perimeter. The very first hour, I invite you to subscribe to Seth Crime Stories so we can begin the forensic analysis of a timeline torn apart. The sheer volume of incoming information from the ransom emails and the pressure of a high-profile missing persons case seemed to fracture the focus of the command structure. Instead of reinforcing the physical boundaries of the crime scene, they began to consider the logistical convenience of returning the property to the family. This thought process fundamentally contradicted every established principle of forensic science. The golden rule of any major investigation is to hold the scene until every conceivable piece of evidence has been documented, collected, and verified. Releasing a scene prematurely is an irreversible action. Once the barrier is lifted and undocumented, individuals enter the space, the microscopic integrity of the environment is permanently destroyed. The footprint of the alleged attacker can be overwritten by the shoe of a family member. The trace DNA left on a door handle can be wiped away by a casual touch. The law enforcement officials reviewing the chilling footage of the armed suspect we are looking at a scenario where advanced technology functioned perfectly, but human protocol entirely collapsed. Same officials who were responsible for safeguarding the ground that suspect had walked on. The disconnect between the severity of the crime captured on video and the lax approach to scene preservation was staggering. As the hours ticked by, on that crucial second day of February, the fate of the physical evidence hung in the balance of a bureaucratic decision. The tension between the need for rigorous forensic processing and the baffling administrative desire to relinquish control of the house created a disastrous pivot point in the investigation. They had the ghost on camera, but they were about to willingly destroy the very ground the ghost had stepped on. The investigators, staring at the frozen frame of the masked suspect, knew that the physical location was their best chance to identify the face behind the mask. The backpack the suspect carried could have brushed against a wall, leaving behind a microscopic transfer of fabric. The weapon tucked into the waistband could have dripped a single droplet of gun oil onto the driveway. These are the minuscule details that solve complex cases when digital trails go cold. A sudden, targeted disconnection severed the security cameras from the outside world, leaving the property entirely blind. The silence of that 41-minute gap holds the key to everything that went wrong. But capturing those details requires an uncompromising dedication to scene security. It requires an agency willing to stand its ground and protect the area for days or even weeks if necessary. As the afternoon sun began to set on the 2nd of February, the agonizing reality of the situation became clear. The visual proof of the heavily armed intrusion was not enough to convince the command staff to maintain their grip on the property. The second day of the second month brought a catastrophic administrative decree that completely derailed the trajectory of the investigation. While specialized units were still attempting to process the immense gravity of the situation, the top brass at the local agency finalized a directive that forensic specialists consider an absolute cardinal sin. By the afternoon hours, the head of the department, Sheriff Chris Nanos, officially released the property back into the custody of the grieving relatives. This decision effectively terminated the secure perimeter less than 24 hours after the initial law enforcement response. Lifting a forensic blockade so prematurely in a suspected kidnapping scenario is not just an oversight, it is a fatal systemic malfunction. To understand how a pristine crime scene devolved into a contaminated nightmare, we have to step. The immediate aftermath of this authorization was a procedural nightmare. Well-meaning friends, relatives, and neighbors began to converge on the property to offer their support. They parked their vehicles in the driveway, masking potential tire tracks left by the getaway transport. They walked up the exact pathways the alleged perpetrator would have used. The absolute pinnacle of this procedural absurdity occurred when a civilian delivering a pizza was permitted to walk directly up to the front entrance. This individual stepped right across the primary zone of conflict where critical biological markers had previously been located. Every single footstep taken by these unauthorized individuals acted as a forensic eraser. Trace elements like synthetic fibers, soil compositions from foreign locations, or microscopic epithelial cells shed by the attacker were systematically obliterated or hopelessly mixed with the DNA of random civilians. In the rigid environment of a courtroom, the foundation of any successful prosecution relies entirely on the chain of custody. Back and look at the carefully constructed environment before those cameras were forced offline. This legal doctrine demands an unbroken, heavily documented chronological record of how evidence was acquired and protected. A defense attorney does not need to prove their client is innocent. They merely need to prove that the evidence handling was compromised. By opening the doors to delivery drivers and mourning neighbors, the agency handed any future defense team a golden ticket. They introduced reasonable doubt directly into the physical foundation of the case. The contamination was so pervasive that even if a miraculous discovery were made later on, the defense could effortlessly argue that the material was brought in by one of the dozens of unchecked visitors. The property was no longer a pristine snapshot of a violent encounter, but rather a biologically chaotic public space. The magnitude of this error cannot be overstated. When dealing with perpetrators sophisticated enough to orchestrate digital extortion, the physical environment is often the only place they make a tangible mistake. A dropped hair, a smudge of sweat, or a microscopic tear in fabric might be the singular thread that unravels their entire operation. An 84-year-old woman living completely alone with limited physical mobility is a scenario that usually demands constant human supervision. Finding those threads requires days of meticulous vacuuming, chemical swabbing, and laser trajectory mapping. It requires an environment frozen in time. Instead, the environment was treated like a temporary inconvenience. The command staff prioritized the emotional comfort of the family over the brutal scientific necessity of scene preservation. In doing so, they inadvertently forced the family to become active participants in the destruction of the very clues that could have brought their loved one home. The sheer volume of foot traffic erased the invisible pathways the attackers navigated. The opportunity to reconstruct the physical mechanics of the abduction vanished beneath the soles of civilian shoes. This administrative failure created an artificial wall between the investigators and the truth. The decision to relinquish control of the premises remains one of the most heavily criticized maneuvers in the history of the department, demonstrating a profound misunderstanding of modern forensic requirements. It was a failure of leadership that turned a challenging case into an almost impossible one. But Nancy Guthrie defied that expectation through a profound reliance on modern technology. If you want to dive deeper into the catastrophic procedural errors that dismantle complex investigations and understand the hidden mechanisms of the justice system, make sure to subscribe to Seth Crime Stories. The tragedy of this compromised location is that the answers to the most agonizing questions were almost certainly trapped inside those walls, waiting to be found before the civilian traffic washed them away. The true horror of what was lost in that premature release becomes glaringly apparent when we finally decipher the medical telemetry data. The chronological discrepancy that had initially baffled cyber analysts was not a glitch, but a harrowing timeline of captivity. The exact moment the internal medical sensor severed its link with the stationary cellular device was a critical piece of spatial evidence. Bluetooth technology operates on a strict physical limitation, typically extending no further than 30 to 40 feet. When that invisible tether snapped, it definitively marked the second the victim was physically forced outside the perimeter of the network. But the critical revelation lies in the massive duration of the delay. Residing in the affluent and quiet Catalina foothills of Arizona, she maintained her fierce independence not through physical strength, but through a meticulously designed smart home ecosystem. There was an excruciating window of time between the initial sabotage of the external surveillance and the final disconnection of the biometric monitor. For nearly 3/4 of an hour, the captive and the alleged assailant occupied the same confined interior space. This was not a swift, seamless extraction. It was a prolonged and likely terrifying ordeal that unfolded entirely off camera. During those agonizing minutes, the attacker had to navigate the interior, locate the target, and manage the logistics of moving a physically limited individual out of the structure. A prolonged operation inside a residential property guarantees the generation of massive amounts of forensic material. There would have been scuff marks on the flooring from dragging or carrying. There would have been defensive wounds, resulting in cast-off spatter or localized bruising. The suspect, sweating under the stress of the operation and the heavy concealment gear, would have inevitably left behind volatile organic compounds and touched DNA on doorways, walls, or furniture. Her mind was exceptionally sharp, capable of managing a complex array of daily medications and schedules. They might have rested a weapon on a countertop, leaving a microscopic trace of gunpowder residue. The interior of that house was a massive three-dimensional canvas painted with the chaotic signatures of a high-stress abduction. Every single minute spent inside exponentially increased the probability of the perpetrator making a critical physical error. That prolonged exposure was the ultimate vulnerability of the attacker's plan. They had blinded the digital eyes, but they could not stop the laws of physics and biology from recording their presence. The environment was screaming with silent testimony. But because the command staff authorized the rapid withdrawal of the forensic perimeter, that testimony was silenced forever. The investigators, who eventually realized the significance of the prolonged interior timeline, were left staring at a completely compromised crime scene. They knew exactly when the struggle happened, and they knew exactly where it happened, but they were completely stripped of their ability to analyze how it happened. The sheer tragedy of the situation is that the sophisticated medical implant functioned flawlessly, providing a perfect temporal roadmap of the crime. It told the authorities exactly where to look for the most concentrated deposits of evidence. Yet her body required the silent, constant oversight of biometric sensors and perimeter security cameras. But the human element of the investigative team failed to match the precision of the technology. They possessed the map, but they voluntarily threw away the magnifying glass. The realization that decades of forensic advancement were rendered entirely useless by a single administrative signature is deeply unsettling. The gap in the timeline was no longer just a mystery, it was an indictment of the procedural collapse. The alleged perpetrators executed a meticulously planned raid, but they were undeniably aided by the sheer incompetence of the local authorities. The criminals created the puzzle, but the law enforcement leadership scattered the pieces into the wind. The agonizing truth is that the identity of the masked individual was likely encoded in a dozen different microscopic formats scattered across the living room and hallways. But those codes were scrambled beyond recognition by the influx of morning visitors and casual deliveries. The physical narrative of the abduction was overwritten, resulting in a permanent, agonizing blank space in the official record. The silence of that timeline is deafening because it represents the exact window where the case could have been undeniably solved. This house was a digital fortress built to compensate for physical frailty. Instead, it remains a monument to the devastating consequences of disregarding basic scientific protocols in the face of immense public pressure. With the physical location effectively ruined, the desperate search was forced to pivot aggressively into the public and digital spheres. The local jurisdiction, having severely handicapped their own evidentiary standing, found themselves rapidly overwhelmed by the escalating complexity of the situation. The presence of the intricate cryptocurrency demands necessitated a massive escalation in resources, triggering the immediate deployment of specialized federal agents. The entire tactical approach shifted from a localized physical search to a globalized digital manhunt. While cyber specialists began the arduous process of tracing encrypted data packets through international servers, the devastating emotional toll of the ordeal spilled onto national television. The daughter of the victim, a highly recognizable media figure, utilized her massive platform to broadcast a raw, unfiltered plea for mercy. Appearing on a major news broadcast, she looked directly into the camera lens and addressed the unseen captors. Her voice broke as she detailed her mother's reliance on specific daily medications, highlighting the acute physical danger of the situation. This was no longer a regional missing persons report. It had mutated into a national spectacle. Every door, every window, and every heartbeat was monitored, logged, and secured. The broadcast was designed to generate overwhelming public pressure and perhaps appeal to whatever fractured sense of humanity the perpetrators might possess. But broadcasting such a desperate message also highlighted the terrifying reality of the investigation. The family was forced to beg on national television because the traditional avenues of law enforcement had stalled out in the contaminated dust of the desert property. The federal agents analyzing the digital extortion quickly realized they were dealing with a remarkably disciplined adversary. The communications were routed through layers of anonymizing networks designed to bounce signals across the globe before delivering the terrifying ultimatums. The perpetrators demanded digital currency precisely because it inherently resists traditional financial tracking methods. They understood the architecture of the modern internet and weaponized it to maintain their absolute anonymity. The authorities were caught in a brutal game of digital cat and mouse, staring at lines of code, while a vulnerable woman remained captive in an unknown location. The transition from a quiet neighborhood to the shadowy corners of the dark web illustrates the terrifying evolution of modern criminal enterprises. But inside that fortified shell, a second invisible clock was still ticking. It was a life lived under the watchful, protective gaze of lenses and data streams. Yet despite the massive influx of federal resources and the intense glare of the national media spotlight, the core mystery remained agonizingly opaque. The agents could track the routing numbers and they could analyze the syntax of the threatening emails, but they could not answer the most fundamental question of the entire case. Every passing hour, without a confirmed sighting or a successful negotiation, plummeted the odds of a safe recovery. The digital hunt was producing incredible amounts of technical data, but none of it translated into a physical location. The stark contrast between the sophisticated cyber analysis and the complete lack of tangible real-world leads created a suffocating atmosphere of helplessness. The physical void left by the ruined crime scene forced the authorities to rely entirely on the perpetrators making a digital mistake. The desperate television appeals faded into the relentless news cycle, and the encrypted countdown timers continued to tick closer to zero. The authorities were left standing at the edge of a digital abyss, holding a mountain of circumstantial data, but completely unable to locate the missing woman. Analyzing this catastrophic sequence of events provides a masterclass in the fragile mechanics of criminal justice and the illusion of technological supremacy. This deep integration with technology was an anomaly for someone of her generation. This case teaches us a brutal lesson about the concept of cross-contamination and its power to single-handedly destroy a prosecution. When a civilian footprint overlaps with a perpetrator's footprint, the resulting evidence is mathematically useless in a court of law. The biological material becomes hopelessly entangled, creating an insurmountable wall of reasonable doubt. A defense attorney will simply argue that any incriminatory material found after the perimeter fell could have been tracked in on the shoe of a delivery driver, completely nullifying millions of dollars of advanced laboratory analysis. Furthermore, what this case teaches us about the intersection of modern security and human protocol is deeply disturbing. We invest heavily in high-definition lenses, biometric tracking, and encrypted networks, believing they offer an impenetrable shield against the outside world. But technology is merely a recording device that cannot preserve a physical environment or make command decisions. The most sophisticated digital infrastructure on the planet is completely worthless if the human beings responsible for handling the aftermath fail to execute basic scientific protocols. The failure here was not a failure of equipment, it was a profound failure of human judgment. But it was the exact mechanism that allowed her to live on her own terms. It highlights a terrifying reality for community safety, where no matter how many cameras watch your property, your ultimate protection relies on the competence of the responding officers. When the bedrock principles of forensic preservation are sacrificed for administrative convenience, the entire system collapses, leaving victims utterly defenseless and perpetrators completely unaccountable. The devastating reality of this investigation is defined by what was casually thrown away during those critical early hours. A vulnerable individual endured a prolonged and violent extraction while the environment silently recorded every desperate moment. But those crucial recordings made of microscopic fibers and biological traces were swept away by a catastrophic failure of leadership. The authorities have spent an immense amount of time chasing digital ghosts across international servers, desperately trying to compensate for the physical evidence they voluntarily destroyed. The agonizing question of her location remains entirely unanswered, trapped behind a wall of contaminated data and encrypted code. And speaking of high-profile investigations completely derailed by shocking administrative negligence, you need to understand the baffling decisions made during the immediate aftermath of the Springfield vanished evidence scandal. She did not need a live-in caretaker, because the house itself was constantly watching over her. If you are ready to dissect another massive failure of the justice system, click the video on your screen right now. And be sure to subscribe to Seth Crime Stories for more deep dives into the dark reality of forensic science. However, this total dependence on a digital shield created a unique vulnerability. If the technology could be bypassed, the physical defenses were practically non-existent. The cameras and sensors were deterrents and recorders, but they could not physically stop an intrusion. They were an illusion of absolute safety that could be shattered by anyone with enough technical knowledge to cut the right wires. On the evening of January 31st, that illusion was still intact. At 9:48 in the evening, her son-in-law brought her back to the Catalina Foothills residence after they had shared a family dinner. Deep within the chest of the resident, a pacemaker continued its steady rhythm, dutifully transmitting biometric data via Bluetooth to a nearby smartphone. He pulled into the driveway and waited diligently. He watched as she safely navigated her way inside. At exactly 9:50 in the evening, the heavy garage door lowered and locked into place. He drove away, leaving her secured within her high-tech sanctuary. From the outside, the house appeared entirely impenetrable. The neighborhood was enveloped in the quiet isolation typical of the foothills, where sprawling properties create vast dark spaces between neighbors. Inside the house, the alarms were set and the medical monitors were silently communicating with their designated servers. It was a routine evening identical to hundreds of evenings before it. But the closing of that garage door marked the last time Nancy Guthrie was seen safely within her established routine. The profound silence that settled over the property after 9:50 in the evening was not the peaceful quiet of a secure home. For exactly 41 minutes, that medical device was the only witness left in the house. It was the heavy, expectant stillness of a trap waiting to be sprung. The sophisticated layers of security were no longer a shield. They had simply become a countdown timer ticking away the final hours of normalcy before the network would be deliberately and violently severed. The perimeter was secure, but the threat was already moving in the shadows outside the reach of the porch lights. For someone whose entire safety net relied on power grids and wireless signals, the darkness outside represented an unquantifiable risk. The Catalina foothills are beautiful, but they are also deeply secluded. The natural desert landscape provides ample cover for anyone wishing to remain unseen while observing a target. For weeks or perhaps even months, the daily routines of the 84-year-old resident could have been mapped out by a patient observer. The predictability of her schedule, the times she received visitors, the exact moments she was left entirely alone. All of this was visible to anyone paying close attention. Then at 2:28 in the morning, the pacemaker signal abruptly dropped. The digital fortress was only as strong as its weakest link, and in this case, the weakest link was the physical isolation of the property itself. When the garage door sealed shut, it did not just lock the world out, it locked her in. The absolute quiet that followed was suffocating. It was the kind of unease that settles in the air when an environment designed for protection suddenly feels like an isolated containment zone. The sensors were armed and the network was active, but a creeping vulnerability had already taken hold of the property. The morning of February 1st began with a glaring deviation from a deeply entrenched routine. Nancy was a woman of unwavering habits, especially concerning her faith and family connections. When she failed to log on for a scheduled church live stream, her absence immediately triggered alarm bells. This was not a casual oversight. It was a stark break in pattern that signaled an immediate and urgent problem. By 11:56 in the morning, the mounting concern drove her family to make the journey to the Catalina Foothills property. They arrived expecting to perhaps find her dealing with a minor medical issue or a technical glitch with her internet connection. It did not fail due to a malfunction. The exterior of the home offered no immediate clues. The desert sun illuminated the quiet facade, and the property appeared just as undisturbed as it had the night before. But as they approached the entrance, the heavy silence of the house felt overwhelmingly oppressive. They unlocked the door and stepped inside, calling out her name. The only response was the echo of their own voices bouncing off the walls of the empty rooms. The house was immaculate, but it was entirely void of life. She was not in the living room. She was not in the kitchen. The medications she relied on daily were left behind untouched. The reality of the situation began to solidify with every empty room they searched. At 12:03 in the afternoon, facing the undeniable fact that she was missing, they dialed 911. The signal vanished because the physical distance between the beating heart and the stationary phone had suddenly stretched beyond the reach of the Bluetooth connection. The call dispatched local law enforcement to what was initially treated as a routine welfare check or a possible missing persons case involving an elderly resident. The first responding officers arrived and began their preliminary walkthrough of the residence. They were operating under the assumption that they might be looking for a senior citizen who had simply wandered off or suffered a sudden medical emergency out of sight. They scanned the immediate surroundings, looking for signs of a fall or confusion. The family waited outside, consumed by a growing sense of dread as the minutes dragged on. The transition from a quiet Sunday morning to an active law enforcement response was swift and disorienting. The officers moved through the property, checking every logical place an 84-year-old woman might be. But the longer they searched, the more apparent it became that this was not a medical crisis. The sheer absence of the resident, combined with the items left behind, painted a deeply disturbing picture. Something or someone had moved the resident out of the digital safety net. An elderly woman with limited mobility simply does not vanish into the desert without her crucial daily medication and her communication devices. The structural integrity of the home appeared intact at first glance, but the atmosphere inside was heavy with the implication of sudden involuntary movement. As the officers expanded their search pattern, moving meticulously from the interior rooms back toward the main points of entry, their focus shifted. They began to look closer at the subtle details of the environment. They were no longer just looking for a person, they were looking for an explanation for an impossible disappearance. The initial confusion of the family was rapidly morphing into a cold, clinical law enforcement investigation. And then as the officers directed their attention to the floor near the primary entryway, the entire nature of the call fundamentally changed. The quiet concern of a welfare check evaporated in a single instant as their eyes locked onto a detail that confirmed their absolute worst fears. The pristine nature of the home was a facade that masked a brief but intense physical struggle. The officers halted their search, immediately establishing a perimeter around the entrance.